Corrie Wright, he was a very keen cricketer. And just before I came to Tairua, he had his own cricket team. He employed enough to have his own cricket team. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I got the job, because a man had left, so I took his place. But we had to get a couple of foreigners in too at that stage. And H.A. was he was the captain, he was the wicket keeper, and he was the blocker. He'd stay there all day. He wouldn't score any runs, but he'd just stay there. You couldn't get the ball past him, but he finally run out of players. And that was, you know, really what Tairua was. I went from the, I'd been taught to shear. I learned how to shear as well, but I only got up to 50 a day. I think the Corrie Wright property was about 5,000 acres. Now that went, which included all this, Paku, he owned that, and it went right to the top of the Finucane Hill, out to the left, which there's a row of cliffs up Graham's Creek. It went there, that was the boundary up there. Nothing was fenced, but that's what the line of it. And then it went out to your right. You followed the ridge out to your right from the top of the Finucane Hill, and you went out there, and after you went in there about half a mile, you come to a big Nikau bush it was in those days. I suppose it wouldn't be a bit surprised if it still isn't there. Although that's 60 odd years ago now. And that's where all the pay had run poly cattle. And they'd always be in that great big clump. Whenever we had to muster them, you always went there. He had it'd be about 5,000 acres. And he was one ridge short of Boat Harbour, where we used to go. And I was then on the mustering of the sheep and all around. And you'd come down, I used to go out, especially in the lambing season, I was out there every day. And you'd come down this ridge from the Nikau bush, and you'd come down to the sailor's grave. Now the sailor's grave was in an open place, little picket fence around it. I went down there a couple of years ago, and there's trees everywhere, and they've shifted that because it's not where it originally was. Where you came down, there was the stream, and it was a little bit further over. And that was the sailor's grave. You all know the sailor's grave. And in fact, I went out once, and someone had been smart and kicked it. It had a little picket fence around it, little short fellas, and somebody had kicked some of them off. And I came home and told the boss, and he said, when you go back there, take a hammer and a few nails. And I did, and I tacked them all back on again. But yes, I used to ride out there every day, and there was, if I had a little bit of spare time, there was a pitchfork we kept down there. I'd run around to the northern end, and the rocks are still there, and get a crayfish to take home, or a couple of crayfish. Just at low tide you could see them, and then just spear them and take them. But you only took what you wanted. When we had a bit more time, we'd go around to the other end of this great big flat rock up this Tairua end of the beach. You go out there, big flat rock, and we used to take a couple of crayfish, cut the tail off, crunch the head, put it into a bag, and just lower it over in the water and have just floating lines of about 10 or 12 feet, and only just the old string. And you see the snapper would come in swimming around, you just flick it over, and we would catch what we wanted, which was 3 or 4 snapper, because it was no good taking them home. There was no fridges or anything in those days. And but it was unbelievable to see those fish, you know, and these big, you'd only pick out the big fellas too, and you see them come in, just flick it over and just pull it slowly in. Oh, gotcha, you know, yeah. And really, looking back on it now, like, absolutely incredible, quite frankly, that stuff that was there. There was an old married chap I went out with a couple of times. Old Dick was his name. I don't know his other name. Dick he was called. And he would go out to these rocks up this northern end, and he had just had a pair of old faded jeans on, and he'd go to the rocks and drop under and stick his feet underneath and whatever he could feel. And next minute he'd flip over and he'd come up with a crayfish in each hand. And he'd just go around the rocks like that. There must have been there in the hundreds really. But of course nobody went out there. You see, if we saw 3 cars a day go through Tairua, that was a lot. Incredible, isn't it? Almost unbelievable. Yeah. And you know, but you just took everything for granted in those days. You just didn't believe that it would never happen again, you know. And and then well, I went on to ploughing. I've done up on Wolf's up there. That was all broken in for Swedes. I was one of them that was up there ploughing, and then over on the other side. There used to be twin carries about halfway up to the top of the Finucane Hill. Are the twin carries still there? Oh, still there. Oh, they're old now. And the twin carries, they were quite big fellas then. And opposite that, because you call it the twin carry paddock, there's a great big hill. I ploughed all that. I'd done that myself with like 4 Tairua. And there was a little batch there, and an old tramp came through. We used to get quite a few swaggies would come through in those days with just a sugar bag on their back. That's all they'd have, and they'd stop and ask for a cup of tea and get something to eat, and away they go. But this old fella, he shacked up in that thing. Bell was his name, someone Bell, I forget his Christian name now. And he actually worked for Tairua for a few months, and then he finally left, and Tairua got a phone call from the Tapu pub a couple of days later. He'd run out of money and he wanted some money set out. He was full as a bull out there, and that was the finish of him. But yeah, Graham's Creek, well of course, there was a dam up the top of Graham's Creek, and HA had a sawmill, and it's still called the mill down there at the foot of Parku, and an odd log would break loose from up there and come down, and unfortunately he'd take me most of the time, and we'd go up to cut it to get it onto his truck. And you know, they were tremendous things, but they're funny. And there was one of these juggers, I don't know whether you've ever used a crosscut or not, but the idea with a crosscut is that you pull and you let go. You pull and you let go. But old Corrie, he not only pulled, but he pushed at the same time when he went back. Oh God, he'd kill you. I used to try to get out of that job. But he had this mill down there, and in fact, the house is still there. Just as you go around the Pippi, there was a little causeway there, and there was a house built just behind that house will still be there. Arthur Heath built that house, and when the logs would come down, they'd break away from up Hickway Way when a big fresh was on, and I'd be like 1 or 2, but old Arthur would be waiting. He'd row out and tow them in, he'd get them milled, and that house there was built of nearly all kauri that drifted down from up there when they'd break loose every now and again. And then of course Tairua, well, they had mainly pine that he used to cut, and of course there was no treatment in any of those days. He had 2 that used to work there, Bill Lopes and of course Sylvia, and they done the sawmill. There was an old chap there called Teddy Nick, little old fella, and I used to love going down to work at Muster Parku because I'd always get a cup of condensed tea with condensed milk in it, which was a bit of a luxury. And old Teddy, of course, he was an old drunk too, and he went up. He was up to all the pensioners used to go. I think there was the 23rd of the month, and they'd be there for 3 or 4 days. And they'd go broken, and they'd all get kicked out again and sent on their way. And Teddy, he left the pub at 2 o'clock in the morning, and when the tide was out, on the causeway bend, not at the causeway, but on the bend there, straight across there, that was the shallowest point. And when the tide was out, it was just about up to your knees. And I found his hat under the Hootacar, but we never ever found Teddy. He must have fallen over in the tide. And that's what his wish was, that when he went, he wanted just to go. And he did. I think he must have went out to sea. We looked everywhere for him, but we never found him. But I found his straw hat, which wasn't much good.
Oh, Bell,
Can't record.
we haven't got my